Taking a closer look, what did Japan's former prime minister do to anger China? And how does it play into countering the regime's threat? We spoke with Grant Newsham, Senior Fellow of Japan Forum for Strategic Studies and Director of One Korea Network, to find out how that might change with Abe's passing. Grant, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you on the show.
Well, glad to be here. Thank you very much.
So what does Shinzo Abe, the former Japanese prime minister's assassination, mean for the region? So not just Japan, but also Taiwan and the broader Indo-Pacific.
Well, Prime Minister Abe really deserves credit for having turned Japan away from this mindless pacifism, which is really ignoring the threats to Japan, to freedom, free countries in the region. He's the guy who turned it around. And after he stepped down, he continued to be really a tireless proponent of a strong national defense for Japan, of free and open Indo-Pacific, which means the free nations getting together to protect their own interests, the things that have allowed the region to prosper. He was also a strong supporter of the US-Japan alliance and also support for Taiwan. And he did have a lot of influence, even post-retirement.
And so following his death, there's already been a lot of reports about kind of the legacy Abe is leaving behind, and you mentioned that too. So what did he do exactly in terms of China especially?
What he did is he set in motion a chain of activities that were going to improve Japan's national defense, its ability to defend itself and to defend its ideals. And what were those specifically? Well, first he managed to reverse a decade of cuts in the Japanese defense budget. So for every year of Abe's administration, he at least managed to get a small increase, and that was a huge change. He managed to change the interpretations of laws regarding so-called collective self-defense, which Japanese bureaucrats and politicians had used for years to handcuff the country so that it couldn't even do the most commonsensical things to build up its defense forces. Abe got that changed, and now you see the Japanese military out and about all over the region. It does real training, it engages with other nations, and none of this used to happen until Abe got that done. And he pushed it through in the face of really opposition from the political class, the commentariat. And that took some nerve. He also got the US-Japan defense guidelines changed. Successfully had that worked out with the Americans. So now Japan can be more of an ally. It can provide real support to US forces where before it couldn't. Additionally, he himself went out all over the world and he spoke up for Japan. And whereas Japanese politicians and prime ministers traditionally had been kind of quiet and they didn't go too many places, but he went out and he spoke up for, say, these democratic ideals. Additionally, you had him, he's the guy that started the Quad. It's an informal security grouping now, but it was Abe's idea that he got going the first time he was in office in 2006. That deserves credit for that. And the expression free and open Indo-Pacific, that's something that came out of his administration. He also kept the Trans-Pacific Partnership idea going after the Americans pulled out just before President Trump was elected. And that has been an important thing, both economically but also politically.
And speaking of that momentum, Grant, do you see that continuing going forward, even without Abe around?
I do. I think that it's pretty well taken hold in Japan's political class, even the Japanese military, but really in the public at large. And interestingly, the Japanese public has always, I think, had a better sense of foreign affairs than most of the Japanese politicians. And they understand the risks facing the country. And to them, it's simply a logical thing that Japan will improve its defense, that it will be able to work better with the Americans. So I think this is a sea change, and one doesn't like to use those words. But as I said, if you've been around Japan a while, today's Japan is practically unrecognizable from what it was a decade ago. And it's also, I think, important to remember that Japan is really, it's been a force for good. Look at its behavior since the end of World War II. You won't find a better behaved, more responsible nation that has done its best to, be a good country that actually is a positive force in the region and globally now.
A troubling new report about China's human rights record. A practitioner of spiritual meditation practice, Falun Gong, says her father was killed through organ harvesting and that she saw his body afterward. We spoke with her and other Falun Gong practitioners at the International Religious Freedom Summit last week in Washington, D.C. Falun Gong is banned in China and has been ever since the Communist Party launched a campaign to eradicate the peaceful practice in 1999. NTD's Melina Weisskopf has more.
So it is still killing people, and my mom is a very good example. She suffered since the very beginning of the persecution for the last 23 years.
His mother was killed just a few months ago after being arrested 3 times and tortured simply for practicing a meditation discipline called Falun Dafa. Practitioners of this ancient spiritual belief follow the principles of truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance.
The more people know about this, the less people will suffer.
And one young girl, Minghui Wang, felt the pressure of the persecution at a very young age. When she was just 5 years old, she saw her mom at a brainwashing center.
Being tied up on a chair with like a thick plastic tube inserted into her nose, and she was being force-fed. That was the first time I ever saw my mother.
She was being used as a pawn in the Chinese Communist Party's agenda to force her mother to give up the practice.
It was a way to break her spirit.
But the Chinese Communist Party's brutal persecution has reached unimaginable horror. Many of these prisoners of conscience are victims of live forced organ harvesting.
What shocked me the most is the stitches on his throat area, and the incision was all the way down, which clearly indicated that my father's organ had been harvested, likely while he was still alive.
Yuhan was 19 years old when her father died.
I stepped closer to unbutton the clothes, and after opening 2 buttons, and the police immediately stopped me and forced my family out of a facility.
But they all tell me that despite this torture and the mental scars, they refuse to renounce their faith.
We believe in truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance. That is not wrong. That is universal principles, and it has made me become a better person.
Because of their perseverance and dedication to the practice and telling their stories of meeting face-to-face with the persecution, the Communist Party was not successful in squashing the Falun Dafa practice.
It really turned my life around pretty quickly, and I was just trying to learn how to be a good person, and it really did that for me.
Their shared message is that this practice is good and it is a crime against humanity to persecute these people for their faith.
China has seen a few recent cases of bird influenza, all of them infecting pigs. The strain is called H9N2. Now, a study by the University of Hong Kong says the virus is recombining with pig flu, producing a virus that may be able to transmit between humans and animals. The research article was published by the School of Public Health at Hong Kong University. It warns that China should continue to monitor the swine influenza virus. From over 800 pig nasal swab samples, researchers detected an A strain last August called H3N2. Its base gene segments come from H1N1, the flu variant that's known to quickly replicate in the human respiratory system. The following month, researchers isolated influenza A virus, a reassortment of multiple swine flu lineages, including H9N2. Studies show the internal genes derived from H9N2 may contribute to animal-to-human transmission. The Pentagon is investing tens of millions of dollars into high-altitude balloons that it intends to use for surveillance. They could someday be used to locate and track China's hypersonic weapons.
Hypersonic missiles are capable of evading conventional American defense systems and boast a long enough range that they could hit the mainland U.S. These missiles could also carry nuclear warheads. Back to the balloons, the altitude ceiling for commercial aircraft is around 43,000 feet, while the high-tech U.S. Reaper drones soar at around 50,000 feet. But a report from Politico says the spy balloons are anticipated to reach as high as 90,000 feet. The report says the technology is shifting from the Defense Department's scientific community to military service, and that the Pentagon is ratcheting up funding on the project for 2023, boosting it up to over $27 million.
First, let's turn to the auto industry. Tesla can no longer be called the world's leading electric vehicle company. That's because Chinese conglomerate BYD has sold more electric vehicles in the first half of this year. BYD, by the way, stands for Build Your Dreams. NTD's Colin Fredrickson has more.
Chinese conglomerate BYD has surpassed Tesla in electric vehicle sales, with 641,000 sold in the first half of this year, while Tesla has only sold 564,000.
The reason for that is Chinese support, Chinese incentives, and getting people employed there and making sure that they buy the cars that support their economy.
Lauren Fix is an automotive expert at Car Coach Reports. Fix says BYD is supported by the Chinese regime.
It has to come down to components and parts and batteries. And if China's controlling the bulk of the supply issue as well as the microchips, they can supply and make the winners and the losers in this industry.
BYD is a conglomerate based in Shenzhen, China, that makes everything from trains and buses to cars. It was founded in 1995 and is one of many electric vehicle producers in China, and Warren Buffett himself owns 7.7%.
It's really hard to tell if BYD will continue to outsell Tesla. It's gaining momentum. It's got some good products out there. It, of course, did not have the COVID lockdowns in China that Tesla did.
Paul Eisenstein is the editor-in-chief at the DetroitBureau.com. Eisenstein says the bigger concern is that Tesla doesn't have many new products coming, while competitors across the world have many. It's still uncertain when we're going to get the Cybertruck.
If they want to be competitive, they could offer more models like BYD does. Inexpensive model would be a huge seller for them.
Julia Moravchek is a regional manager at Driven, a company that provides in-person Tesla courses. She says BYD has copied designs from other automakers and is innovating with its battery technology.
With a top sporting event scheduled for Shanghai this fall, will the city fully be reopened from virus-driven closures in 3 months' time? Local authorities say maybe not. The World Golf Tournament, the WGC HSBC Champions, was planned for October, but got canceled this Wednesday. The city remains under partial lockdown, driven by China's zero COVID-19 policy, even though city officials said they're easing the curbs. The golf tournament draws some of the globe's best athletes in the sport, with prize winnings topping $10.5 million. The event is held annually in China, but this year's cancellation marks the third in a row. Last Monday, the head of the city of Beijing's Chinese Communist Party branch addressed the ongoing virus measures. He revealed that, quote, in the next 5 years, Beijing will persistently grasp regular pandemic prevention and control. His statement sparked immediate uproar. Later, a state-run newspaper removed the words 5 years from his speech. Some have drawn parallels between his statement to what's happening now in Shanghai. Locals are still subject to strict rules, including mandatory mass virus testing, with some of them still confined to their homes. Now we turn to international diplomacy. U.S. Ambassador Nicholas Burns is once again getting iced out of Chinese social media. The latest instance marks the third time Burns' statements have been removed from social media in his consular country, after he took the position in April. He responded to it in a recent Twitter post, saying the PRC ought to allow the Chinese people to see what American leaders say, as the American people hear what Chinese leaders say. PRC is short for the People's Republic of China, the country's formal name. Some of Burns' earlier posts were deleted from Weibo and WeChat, two major social platforms in China that both have hundreds of millions of monthly active users. As for what Burns has said in the now deleted posts, one shared a link to details about the NATO Military Alliance Summit. Two others mentioned comments from the White House and the U.S. State Department related to the 25th anniversary of Hong Kong's return to China. Similar social media deletions tied to other U.S. officials have also happened repeatedly. Secretary of State Antony Blinken's speech on U.S. policy towards China earlier this year faced a blanket ban on Chinese social media. Those statements against his speech from Chinese officials were widely spread across the country. What's more, the official account of the U.S. Consular General in Shanghai got entirely shut down on Weibo in 2012. The nominee for a crucial Treasury position in the Biden administration said he wants to limit China's global lending influence. Jay Shambaugh is President Biden's choice for Treasury Undersecretary for International Affairs. He has served as an economic advisor to the Obama administration. During his confirmation hearing before the Senate Finance Committee on Tuesday, Shambaugh explained how he plans to achieve Washington's goals. For one, he says the U.S. should work with international financial institutions and development banks. Together, they'd give other countries alternatives to borrowing from communist China. He pointed out the competition between China's state-controlled economic model and the U.S. model, driven by rule of law, transparency, and free markets. He added China should no longer be considered a developing country, noting all developing countries are eligible for World Bank loans. Let's take a closer look at that point. Last year, the World Bank introduced a plan to lend China $1 to $1.5 billion every year through low interest rates. That was planned to continue for 5 years. The U.S. objected to the move, saying China should no longer be considered a developing country. But the World Bank didn't side with the objection. And even before that plan, the World Bank had already given China billions of dollars in aid. At the same time, the communist regime has been lending hundreds of billions of dollars to dozens of countries through its Belt and Road Infrastructure Initiative. Experts say the project helps expand Beijing's influence on the world stage.
A former Japanese criminal gang member says he witnessed a patient being prepared for live organ harvesting in a Chinese hospital. He says he saw a Falun Gong practitioner with tendons cut before the man's liver was carved out for a transplant. It comes as research published this April accuses Chinese surgeons of taking hearts out from inmates who are still alive. Here's NTD's Jane Worrell with more.
As evidence mounts, the Chinese regime continues its lucrative organ trade from prisoners of conscience. A former criminal gang member in Japan recalls witnessing it. It was in 2007 that his friend's brother's liver failed, and they desperately tried to find him a liver transplant.
To have a liver transplant, if you were to do it, the only option would be to do it in America, France, or China. But the waiting time is very long in America and France, and he couldn't wait. It also costs a lot, and the regulations are very strict. So we chose Beijing, China. In Beijing, there's a military police hospital where they receive Japanese people. What about the donor? They said, we can have it ready straight away.
He says the family of the patient found the albumin from the Chinese hospital. A protein needed for a liver transplant wasn't good enough. So Segura helped them buy the solution in Japan and smuggle it into Beijing with the sanction of the Chinese hospital. The day before the scheduled surgery, he was asked if he'd like to take a look at the donor.
When I opened the curtain, the donor was sleeping, drugged. He was sleeping. He had surgery to sever the tendons in both of his hands and feet the day before. I asked why. One reason was to prevent him from running away. Also, if a donor is tense, the body would shrink, which isn't good for the organs. That's the reason for this surgery. Then leave the patient in a hazy state with anesthesia like a drug. A young and very good liver, he said. I thought, terrible. He said, there are many people in China, so we can have donors. We can prepare matching ones, and there are so many bad people who have to die, so best to utilize them.
When he asked the doctor what the man had done, the doctor said he's from a terrorist group, and after pressing more, he answered, Falun Gong. Falun Gong is an ancient spiritual practice that's based on the principles of truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance. Falun Gong practitioners have been brutally persecuted under the Chinese regime since 1999.
Doctors killed.
In 2019, a People's Tribunal held in London found that Falun Gong practitioners were probably the main source of supply for forced organ harvesting, and there was evidence of mass medical testing of the Uyghur ethnic group. There are reports that say the Chinese regime is targeting the Uyghur ethnicity for organ harvesting to market them to recipients in Saudi Arabia. Investigative journalist and author of the book The Slaughter, Ethan Gutman, says the medical community needs to be more aware about how the Chinese regime works.
Whenever I'm asked what people can do about it, I just simply say, talk to your doctor. Ask them, have they heard of the issue? I don't care if it's their gynecologist. I don't care if it's your dentist. Talk to those people in the medical establishment. That is the way grassroots to push this issue to the top. This is a deep corruption of medicine. I shouldn't even have to say such a thing. It's so obvious. But the medical world has chosen to obfuscate and to ignore the issue. And unfortunately, they find it very hard to climb down from the position that, we should work together with the Chinese to solve this. I understand why they maybe felt they had to give it a try. Everything's worth giving a try at least once. But when something fails, and that's what the Uyghur situation indicates, is that it failed, leave the Uyghurs alone. Leave the Falun Gong alone. Move on. Start creating look, I would love to see an ethical Chinese transplant system. I would love to see an ethical Chinese medical system. I'm happy to move on from this field.
Investigations show China's organ transplant program to be one of the largest in the world. So far, a handful of countries have passed legislation that would stop their citizens from travelling there for organ tourism. Jane Worrell, NTD News.